Last year, I decided to take a road trip to visit two of my closest friends from high school. They had moved to Berkeley to study at the University of California, and since then it had become a tradition for me to visit them every summer. Normally, I would just take a plane. It was quicker, easier, and more convenient. But last year, I wanted the journey to be different. There were places along the way I had always wanted to explore: national parks, museums, historical landmarks. So I figured, why not? A road trip it was. I left early in the morning, excited about the adventure ahead. The first 2 days were amazing. The open road, the changing landscapes, the freedom, it was everything I had hoped for. But on the third day, something changed. I had expected to reach my destination by evening, but I was still driving well into the night. The highway was eerily quiet, with barely another car in sight. It was peaceful, yet unsettling. I've never been fond of desolate roads. Around 9 or 10 p.m., fatigue started creeping in. My eyelids felt heavy, my mind sluggish. I needed a break, a quick stop to stretch my legs, use the restroom, and grab a coffee to shake off the drowsiness. Soon I spotted a small rest stop by the roadside. It wasn't one of those large, well-lit ones with gas stations and fast food joints. It was just a simple building with a row of parking spaces, but it was enough. As I pulled in, I immediately noticed something. It was dark, too dark. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just silence. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. I parked, stepped out, and stretched, trying to shake off the stiffness from hours of driving. The night air was cold and still. Inside the rest stop, the place felt even more deserted. A dimly lit hallway led to the restrooms, a janitor's closet, and a couple of vending machines. I browsed the machines, considering an energy drink, when I saw headlights sweep across the parking lot. A car had pulled in. At first, I didn't think much of it until I noticed where it parked, right next to mine. Out of all the empty spaces, why park so close? My gut twisted, but I told myself not to overreact. Maybe they just had the same idea as me, a quick stop to rest. I went into the restroom, trying to shake off the unease. 5 minutes later, I stepped out and my heart skipped a beat. The car was still there, engine running, headlights on, and the driver still inside. I glanced around, searching for any other sign of life. Nothing. Just me and whoever was in that car. Trying to ignore the creeping dread, I walked back to the vending machine and grabbed a Red Bull. But I couldn't help myself. I stole another glance at the car. The engine was still running. My palms felt clammy. I turned to leave. Just as I stepped towards the door, I heard it. The engine cut off. A door creaked open. I froze. A tall, bearded man stepped out wearing a brown leather jacket. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and his eyes were locked onto me. Dark, unreadable. My stomach tightened. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe he was just another traveler. No reason to panic. But every instinct in me screamed that something was off. As he approached, I gave him a polite nod. He nodded back. Just a stranger passing by. I was almost past him when it happened. "Hey," he called out. I turned, and I found myself staring down the barrel of a 9mm pistol. Time stopped. My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" he asked, his voice dripping with amusement. A sick, twisted amusement. I raised my hands, my mind racing. Stay calm. Do what he says. Survive. "What do you want?" My voice barely came out. "Your watch, your wallet, your phone," I obeyed without hesitation, handing over everything. My body was trembling, but I hoped, prayed that this was it. He'd take my stuff and leave. But he didn't. With a tilt of his head, he motioned for me to move. Not towards the rest stop, towards the woods behind it. Panic surged through me. No. I gave you everything, I stammered. "Please, just take my car if you want. Walk." His voice was sharp, final. terror clawed at my throat. He wasn't just robbing me, he was leading me into the darkness of the forest. I knew what that meant. He was going to kill me. I wanted to run, to fight, to do anything, but what could I do against a gun? My legs felt like lead as I followed his command, each step heavier than the last, deeper into the woods, away from any chance of help. About 20 meters in, he stopped. Turn around. I did. The gun was aimed directly at my face. I was going to die. I thought of my parents, how they'd get the news, the pain it would bring them. Tears streamed down my face. My body shook so violently I could barely stand. Kneel. I dropped to my knees, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for the end. Then, bang, 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 I screamed, throwing my hands over my ears, collapsing to the ground. I was dead. I had to be dead. But there was no pain, no burning sensation, just fear, raw, all-consuming fear. Then I heard it. Laughter. The man was laughing, a deep, mocking laugh that made my skin crawl. He leaned in, grinning. Go home, kid, and don't forget to wash your pants. And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving me shaking, crying in the dirt. A cruel joke, a twisted game. I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually I forced myself to stand, stumbling back to the rest stop. I looked in the mirror. My face was a mess, red, swollen, covered in tears and sweat. I felt humiliated, broken. I drove straight to the nearest town, borrowed a phone, and called the police. They took my statement, but I never heard if they caught him. The next day, I drove straight to my friend's house. No stops, no detours. I never told my parents what happened. I didn't want them to worry, but for months, I felt the lingering dread. Even now, when I think back to that night, I feel it all over again. I survived, but I was never the same, and I never ever stop at rest stops anymore. No other vehicle had passed him for several minutes before the accident occurred. His words sent a chill down my spine. If there was no car coming at full speed toward me, then what had I seen? What had forced me to swerve so violently that I lost control of my truck? I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but no matter how much I thought about it, nothing made sense. The only conclusion I kept coming back to was that whatever I had seen wasn't real, or at least not in the way I understood reality. That night, as I lay in my hospital bed, I couldn't stop thinking about William's words. My mind raced with the possibilities, but my exhaustion eventually pulled me into an uneasy sleep. It didn't take long before the nightmares came. I was back on that road, driving through the rain and the fog, the oppressive silence wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Then, out of nowhere, the blinding headlights appeared once again, heading straight for me. I tried to swerve, but this time, I was frozen, unable to move. The lights got closer and closer until they were right in front of me, and then nothing. Just darkness. I woke up in a cold sweat, my breathing ragged. The room was dark, but I could feel it again. The presence. I turned my head slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. There it was, the shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed, unmoving, watching. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was paralyzed, just like in my nightmare. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing down on me. The figure leaned in closer, and though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its presence looming over me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The weight lifted, and I gasped, finally able to move. My hands were shaking as I reached for the nurse's call button, but something inside me told me they wouldn't believe me. Just like before, I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, determined to find answers, I called William again. I told him everything, the figure, the nightmares, the overwhelming feeling that something beyond our understanding was responsible for my accident. I expected him to dismiss it, to say it was just my injuries or the medication playing tricks on my mind. But he didn't. Instead, there was a long pause before he finally spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "You're not the first person to experience this. A few years ago, my brother had an accident on that same stretch of road. He told me he saw something, a figure standing in the middle of the road. He swerved to avoid it, lost control and crashed. He survived, but he was never the same after that. He kept saying the figure followed him, haunted him. And then one day, he disappeared." My blood ran cold. "Disappeared?" I repeated. "Yes. He left his house one evening and never came back. The police searched for him, but there was no trace. The only thing they found was his car, abandoned on that very road where his accident happened." I could hear the emotion in William's voice, the fear, the pain of losing someone he loved without explanation. And now it was happening to me. The figure wasn't just a hallucination, it was real, and it wasn't finished with me yet. A terrifying realization settled over me. If William's brother had vanished after seeing the figure, what did that mean for me? Was I next? I had to find out the truth before it was too late. The cars led us deeper into the forest, the narrow dirt road twisting and turning through the dense trees. The headlights from the vehicles barely illuminated the thick foliage, casting eerie shadows that danced in the darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, sweat forming on my brow despite the cool night air. My heart pounded in my chest as my mind raced through the worst possibilities. Who were these guys? What did they want with us? And more importantly, how were we going to get out of this alive? As we drove further in, the road became rougher, and I could feel the weight of my cargo shifting slightly with every bump and dip. I stole glances at the car ahead of me, where Neil was being held. His silhouette was barely visible through the rear window, but I could sense his fear as much as my own. The second car remained close behind me, ensuring I had no option to turn back. Finally, we reached a small clearing in the middle of the woods. The lead car came to a sudden stop, and I barely had time to react before slamming on the brakes. My truck groaned as it halted, the engine humming in protest. The car behind me stopped just as abruptly, boxing me in. My stomach twisted in knots. The three men got out, their guns still drawn. One of them yanked open the passenger door of the lead car, pulling Neil out roughly. He stumbled but managed to stay on his feet. The ringleader, the one who had done most of the talking before, approached my truck and banged on the door with the butt of his gun. "Out. Now." I took a deep breath, my mind frantically searching for a way to escape. But I knew resisting wasn't an option. Not when we were so outnumbered and unarmed. Slowly, I unbuckled my seatbelt and climbed down, my boots crunching against the gravelly dirt. Neil was standing a few feet away, his eyes wide with terror. The three men surrounded us, their weapons gleaming under the pale moonlight. The leader paced in front of us, eyeing us both like a predator deciding on its next move. "All right," he finally said, his voice calm but laced with malice. "You two are in a bit of a predicament. We don't want any trouble." I spoke cautiously. "You've got our money, our phones. Just let us go." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, it's not about the money, driver. You see, we need something else." A chill ran down my spine. What the hell did that mean? He gestured toward my truck. "You're hauling steel, right?" I hesitated before nodding. "Yeah. Why?" "We need it." I furrowed my brows. "Steel? You're hijacking us for steel sheets?" The leader smirked. "Not just steel. What's inside that truck is worth a hell of a lot more than you think." My confusion deepened. I had no idea what he was talking about. As far as I knew, I was just transporting regular construction material. Neil swallowed hard. "Look, man, we're just drivers. We don't know anything about what's in there." The leader nodded as if considering our words. then suddenly turned to one of his men. "Open it up." One of the goons holstered his gun and walked toward the back of my truck. I clenched my fists, helpless to stop him as he unlocked the doors and swung them open. The metal creaked as the dim interior was revealed. Stacks of steel sheets were neatly packed inside, nothing out of the ordinary. The leader sighed in disappointment. "Well, that's a shame." Then, without warning, he raised his gun and pointed it at Neil's head. "No!" I shouted, stepping forward, but another gun was instantly trained on me. Neil's breath came out in panicked gasps. "Please, man, we don't know anything, I swear." The leader stared at him for a long moment before lowering his weapon. Neil let out a shaky breath, and I felt a sliver of relief, but it was short-lived. "Load up the steel," the leader ordered his men. "And them?" He turned to me with a sinister grin. "We can't have loose ends." My blood ran cold. I knew what was coming. I had to think fast. As I drove through the lonely stretch of highway, my mind kept replaying the harrowing events of that night in Missouri. The faces of those men, the fear in Neil's eyes, and the eerie silence of the forest lingered like shadows in my memory. But life goes on, and so did I. The road had always been my home, my escape, and despite everything, I was still out here, hauling loads from one end of the country to the other. My name is Ernesto, and the story I am about to tell you now is the scariest experience I have ever had in my life. It happened one night while I was working in Arizona, driving through an area so isolated that it felt like I was the last person on Earth. The moon hung high in the sky, casting eerie shadows on the endless desert landscape. The only company I had was the soft hum of my truck's engine and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. I had been on the road for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. I knew I needed to find a place to pull over and rest soon, but there wasn't a single truck stop or gas station in sight. As I rounded a bend, I spotted something strange up ahead, a set of dim headlights flickering in the distance. As I got closer, I saw that it was an old, rusted-out pickup truck parked on the side of the road, its hood propped open. A man stood beside it, waving his arms frantically. Instinct told me to keep driving, but my conscience got the best of me. I had been in situations before where I needed help, and I knew what it felt like to be stranded. I slowed my rig and pulled over a few feet ahead of the truck. Stepping down from my cab, I kept my guard up as I approached the man. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. His clothes were dusty and tattered as if he had been out there for days. "Thank you, sir. I was starting to think nobody would stop," he said, his voice raspy and dry. "What seems to be the problem?" I asked, keeping my distance. "Engine overheated," he said, motioning toward the steaming hood. "I was hoping to get a lift to the nearest gas station, maybe call for a tow." I hesitated. Something about this situation felt off. "Nearest station is about 40 miles back," I told him. "Not much out here." The man scratched his head, looking around nervously. "I'd be much obliged if you could take me that way." A cold shiver ran down my spine. The way he said it, the way his eyes darted toward the dark desert behind him, it was unsettling. That's when I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. There were footprints in the dirt beside the truck. Not just his, but multiple sets, leading away from the road and into the darkness. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Look, Before I could finish, something moved in the shadows. A second figure emerged from the darkness, then a third. My instincts screamed at me to run. I turned and sprinted back to my truck, jumping into the cab and locking the doors. The man ran after me, slamming his fists against the driver's side window. "Hey, come on, man, don't be like that," he shouted. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, watching in my side mirror as the figures disappeared into the night. My heart hammered in my chest as I sped down the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. It wasn't until I reached a well-lit truck stop miles later that I finally exhaled. I sat there in my cab for a long time, trying to shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped something terrible. I never did find out who those people were or what they had planned, but I never stopped for a stranded vehicle in the middle of nowhere again. The road is unpredictable. You never know what's waiting around the next bend. And sometimes the scariest things out there aren't ghosts or monsters. They're people. It was a good place to work, so much so that I would venture to say it was probably the easiest job I have ever had. But the only downside was having to drive an hour and a half home every night. It was truly exhausting. I hated it at first, as it took a big chunk of my free time, but over time I just got used to it. One night during my usual commute home, I stopped at a taco truck about halfway there to grab a bite to eat. I was completely starving and couldn't wait until I got home. The truck was located outside an RV park, so I assumed the owner either lived there or drove there every night to sell his tacos. The truck had been working at that location for about 2 months. I had seen it several times before but never stopped, mostly because I was always in too much of a hurry. But that night I was so hungry that my stomach was loudly protesting. So when I saw the sign in the distance, I pulled off the road toward the trailer park entrance, got out of my car, and walked to the truck. To my surprise, the guy was preparing some of the best tacos I had ever eaten in my life. I ordered them to go and ate them in my car. I was truly in awe of how delicious they were, or maybe it was just the hunger, but they tasted like pure glory. I drove home that night feeling like I had made a great culinary discovery. So the next night I did the exact same thing. And the next, it became a regular stop on my way home from work. I wouldn't eat in desperation in my car anymore either. Now, I would stand next to the truck, savor my tacos with a bit of gusto, take advantage of the variety of salsas the guy offered, and then close my meal with a soda and a cigarette. He even had those nice lemon-scented hand wipes, which he always gave me, and I would always save some for the ride home. I must have done this maybe 40 or 50 times over the next few months, but despite stopping by almost every night and striking up conversations with him quite often, I curiously never knew the guy's name. I didn't ask the first time, and then I just never did. It didn't seem necessary. He didn't ask mine either. He was just one of the many hardworking people I admired. But I wish I had asked, because the day came when knowing his name might have been a matter of life or death. That night, I parked my car in the usual spot and walked over to the truck as usual. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until it wasn't. This was the first time I had come here and the taco guy wasn't in the truck, preparing his food. There didn't seem to be any customers either. I was alone. At first, I thought it was just good timing, and that I wouldn't have to wait in line. But after several minutes of waiting, something felt off. I started calling out, expecting him to pop out from behind the truck or come running from somewhere, but there was no response. The area was eerily quiet. No cars on the road, no signs of life from the trailer park. Then, I noticed the smell. Something was burning. I stood on my tiptoes but couldn't see what was on the grill. But I could smell it and I could see smoke. I yelled again, saying something dumb like, "Hey, I think you're burning something here, buddy." But still, there was only silence, except for the sizzling sound coming from the grill. This was a large taco truck, not one of those small ice cream truck-sized ones. It was big and well-equipped. That's why I couldn't see what was on the grill. Frustration turned into concern. If that something kept burning, it could be dangerous. It could ruin his grill. Or worse, the truck could catch fire. And above all, I genuinely liked the guy. He worked hard every night, providing something good and reliable, and I respected that. If it were my truck, I would want someone to turn off the flame. So, I walked around the side to where the entrance was. There was a narrow door with retractable stairs. I climbed up, grabbed the handle, and opened it. The first thing I saw was an empty, open cash register with its drawer overturned, loose change scattered around. My first thought was a robbery, but I didn't see signs of a struggle. Maybe someone had pulled a gun on him, forced him to leave, and then emptied the register. That thought infuriated me. This guy had worked hard and some lowlife had stolen his earnings. But at least, I hoped, he wasn't hurt. Then I stepped up to the grill to turn it off. As I did, my heart nearly stopped. My breath caught in my throat. Burning on that grill, sizzling under the flames, was the perfect jet black outline of a completely scorched human hand. Shock sent me reeling backward down the small stairs, but I caught myself. My mind raced. I forced myself not to look at it again as I fumbled to shut off the flame. Then, I turned and walked straight back to my car to call the police. I wasn't even sure what to tell the dispatcher. A robbery? An attack? I knew someone had been seriously hurt, but I didn't know where they had gone. Worse, I didn't even know his name. I answered a barrage of questions and was told that a couple of officers would be sent over. It wasn't necessary for me to stay, but I did. I wanted to see if the taco guy would show up, bandaged but okay. But no one came. Not him, not the police. I waited nearly an hour. No sirens, no flashing lights. Nothing. Frustrated and unsettled, I finally left, driving home in a numb haze. My mind spun the entire way, replaying the scene, wondering why the cops hadn't rushed to the scene when something so terrible had happened. I still regret never knowing his name. Maybe I could have looked him up, helped somehow. In the following days, I searched online for news. Taco truck owner burned by robber. Taco truck attack. Anything. But nothing came up. The truck was gone. The taco guy was gone, and I never saw him again. Figured this way I could maximize my time without having to pay for a hotel, and thus save myself some money. The trip there was fine, but the return trip, it was a very different story. I ended up leaving around 10 p.m. According to Apple Maps, I estimated it would take about 4.5 hours to get home. I had made about half of the drive when I started getting tired. I tried to stay awake by washing my face with water from my canteen several times, but it was no use. At one point, it was getting dangerous to drive. I told myself that at the next rest stop I saw, I would pull over and take an hour nap before continuing on my way. I could still make it home at a pretty decent hour. So, I did exactly what I set out to do. A few miles down the road, I found a rest stop and pulled into the parking lot. The first thing I noticed was the lack of cars. The place was completely empty, and if it hadn't been for some lights on, I would have thought it was abandoned. But I guess this made sense, since it was pretty late and this wasn't a busy road. I leaned back in my seat and set an alarm to go off in an hour. When it went off, I realized I would have to go inside the building because now I had to use the bathroom. My bladder always complicating things for me. I started walking toward the building. When I entered, I found the restrooms and opened one of the stalls. I wasn't even there for about 30 seconds when suddenly I could hear someone talking outside the restrooms, in the hallway. This surprised me. I hadn't even heard the front door open, and my car was the only one in the parking lot just a minute ago. I didn't see how someone could have gotten here so fast. Then, the restroom door opened. By that time, I was a little nervous, but I reasoned it was most likely just another normal person that I somehow didn't notice. So, I didn't give it much thought. I was ready to leave when a light knocking on the stall door got my attention. Awkwardly, I responded, "There's someone here." Silence. Now I was a little more nervous. I decided to stand in the stall until whoever it was left. That's when I noticed an eye peering through the crack in the stall door. When we made eye contact, the guy started screaming and relentlessly banging his head against the door. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath, starting to feel scared. Thinking fast, I used my whole body to block the door, trying to keep him from breaking it. But seeing that he wouldn't stop banging and screaming, I threw the door open and knocked the guy down, then ran as fast as I could out of the bathroom and toward my car. I was halfway to the parking lot when I heard the front door open behind me. I turned to look. Sure enough, the guy was chasing me. However, I was much faster. I finally got to my car, started it up, and began backing out. But the guy caught up to me and managed to slam his body into my door. As I accelerated, I looked in my rearview mirror. As I drove away, I saw the guy get up like it was nothing and just stand there staring in my direction. I was beyond shocked. I couldn't process what had just happened. Honestly, I didn't know what to think. You always hear crazy stories like this, but you never think it will actually happen to you. When I left the rest stop, I was so freaked out that I was probably speeding for a few miles. The rest of the way home, I couldn't even think about sleep. My body was pumped with adrenaline after my close encounter with whatever that was. I still have no idea who he was, where he came from, or what his damn problem was. If I had to guess, I'd say he was probably a homeless guy who just wasn't right in the head. But then again, why would a homeless person be in the middle of nowhere on the side of the freeway? It doesn't make sense. How did he get there? All I know is that I've never stopped at a rest stop since, and I plan to keep it that way for the rest of my life.